Sometimes, to find yourself, you have to lose everything you once called home. But what if you're not ready to reclaim what you've lost? What if freedom isn't what you hoped for but an unimaginable void whispering, "Now you're alone"? Hello, my name is Beatrice. Last year, I changed my status to Mrs. and added a wedding ring alongside my collection of courtroom victories. That's right, you heard me. My place is the podium, the courtroom, where I confidently deliver arguments like a seasoned attorney, knowing every twist and nuance of the law. Yet, what I couldn't predict was that I'd one day need a defense strategy for family dinners. So let me crash your evening for a bit because, well, I'm already here. My friend Tom, Mama's boy, whose position in life is hard to overestimate, is the reason. I completely understand why Mrs. Falcone, his mother and queen bee of their hive, dotes on him. She's the woman who raised 2 kids alone, an insanely strong pillar of support for Sarah, his sister. And Sarah? That's another story. She fancies herself the center of the universe, and in her circle, she probably is. I still remember stepping into their apartment for the first time. Tom, proudly showing me off to everyone, hugged me in a way that made me feel like a trophy. The living room was like a shrine, every detail, photos of Tom and Sarah, displayed like relics. Cozy, but in a way that made you feel like an outsider, as if you'd wandered onto a set where they'd been playing family games for years, and I had appeared as a guest star. Mrs. Falcone approached me with a smile so strained it felt obligatory, hiding a kaleidoscope of emotions underneath. She looked at me like one might regard a car they're unsure about buying. Her eyes flickered with thoughts like, "I'm smiling because I'm supposed to, but I'd rather scrub bathroom grout with a toothbrush while wearing one of those floral outfits that scream, 'I'm the head of this family.'" "Beatrice, dear, Tom has told us so much about you," she said, her tone as sharp and cold as her demeanor. I smiled politely, understanding this meeting would be as strategic as any courtroom battle. And then there was Sarah, who just couldn't resist. She swooped in like a hawk, sat opposite me, and started interrogating. "So, Beatrice, what's life like as a lawyer? I imagine you in court, like on TV, making money. So, how much do you actually earn?" I nearly choked on my wine. Who even asks that outright? I laughed, masking my irritation. "Oh, that's a trade secret," I replied, keeping my composure. Mrs. Falcone immediately jumped in, as if it were a game, pressing further. "But can't you give us at least a ballpark figure? It's for family, after all." Tom shot me a look, perhaps meant to beg me not to get angry, but I kept my face neutral. If I had $1 for every time someone asked me that, I'd be rich enough to change the subject, I retorted. Mrs. Falcone sniffed and exhaled loudly. "Well, it's no secret what a teacher makes, right?" she said, almost as if consoling herself. Tom looked at me with an expression that said his hopes for a normal evening had just been dashed. "Let's not go there," he said, waving dismissively as though brushing aside a servant. But she wasn't giving up. "Don't worry, dear, you're part of the family now, so you'll be sharing with us and taking care of us too." Tom, sensing I was about to escalate, looked at me with a silent plea for peace. It was then I realized I wasn't just marrying Tom. I was stepping into a game, a subtle, internal Cold War where the roles were made up on the fly. A few weeks passed, and there I was, standing in her cozy kitchen apron, simmering chili from Mrs. Falcone's recipe, the dish she'd used to try winning my loyalty. Mrs. Falcone and Sarah had developed a new habit of showing up unannounced, as if forgetting this wasn't their territory. "Your chili needs more spice," Sarah declared, watching me stir the pot. Mrs. Falcone, wielding a ladle as if searching for treasure, scrutinized the pot with the intensity of someone decoding an ancient mystery. "Less salt," she remarked, continuing to pick at the dish while fixing me with a knowing look. "Watch your husband's blood pressure," she added, as if this were the singular duty of any woman in this household. I, of course, responded internally, rolling my eyes so hard I practically saw my brain. Sarah wasn't far behind. She leaned back in her chair like the Queen of Sheba, exuding confidence and making no attempt to hide her satisfaction. "I see, Beatrice, you're such a neat person. It's almost as if you follow some kind of virtue, isn't it?" she said, staring at me as if I were an imperfect ideal. Mom nodded, her gaze softening slightly as though ready to endorse anything her daughter said. Naturally, Sarah gave herself a mental high five. It was funny, considering I'd cleaned the place that very morning. I wiped a stain off the counter, noticing I hadn't quite gotten it all. Tom, in another room, oblivious, probably engrossed in some video game or sports stats, had no idea I was about to fill him in on the details of this little invasion of our home. I stuck my head into the other room, where he sat slouched on the couch. "Hey, babe, how are you holding up?" I said, trying to lighten the mood a little. Tom blinked at me for a moment, as though worried he might miss an important play. "Your mom and Sarah," I continued, "they show up, take over everything, nitpick everything I do like they're searching for reasons to complain, to point out something I let slip. Oh, Beatrice, they didn't mean any harm, you know that, you always say." Tom scratched his head and replied, "I'll talk to them. They'll calm down, and everything will be fine." He seemed to think it would all resolve itself, but I felt like I was trapped in the final round of some cooking competition, the lone contestant, with judges waiting hungrily for a mistake. "So, when's dinner?" Sarah asked, keeping me on edge. She looked at me as if I wasn't here to enjoy myself but to cater to everyone's every whim. Each time I decided the chili was ready, my voice came out so light it felt like a movie credit roll, every trope a subtle attempt to navigate an uncomfortable situation. The walk to dinner felt theatrical, scanning their faces as if they were an audience waiting for me to stumble. Mrs. Falcone stirred her bowl, examining each bean as though it held the universe's secrets, but not quite the way I had intended. She called it a good effort, but added, "You didn't quite get it right." Tom, bless him, looked at me with an unbothered expression and said, "It's amazing, isn't it?" His mom nodded, though her smile seemed to have already decided I'd lost, while Sarah, standing behind her, muttered something like, "Not bad." Mrs. Falcone shrugged as if agreeing with the harshest restaurant critic. When they left, Tom patted his stomach and said everything was fine. I stood by the door, feeling small, like I was losing a game I hadn't even agreed to play. It seemed like the same old song every time they came over, the same complaints, the same questions. Business as usual, except I might be growing a bit tired of these unspoken rules. Next time they came, it would be the same familiar tune. And that's when I started dreaming of something different, something more normal, where I wouldn't have to weigh every word on a scale. A few words from Tom could change everything, I thought, maybe asking him to talk to his mom about boundaries. But perhaps I'd been naive, thinking not getting married was the hard part. Fitting into Tom's family? That was the real challenge. They had their idea of family, and mine was entirely different. As I wrestled with this quiet standoff, the phone rang again. The sound was familiar, a call I had been dreading. I glanced at the screen, and my heart sank. It was Mrs. Falcone. I looked at Tom, hoping he'd flinch at the tone his mother's call would inevitably take. But no, he remained glued to the TV, his attention fixed, immovable, indifferent. He seemed entirely unaware of the tension swelling between us, like a gathering storm cloud ready to burst. Across the room, I felt a cold shadow descending, like a statue with a beating heart. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. We were trying to establish boundaries. I said as much. My voice tightened around the thin but sturdy boundaries I was trying to hold, like a spring coil to keep everything from spilling out. Mrs. Falcone snapped. "That's just a trendy word to shut us out." Her words landed like a crashing storm. She was furious, and I blinked back at her, trying to understand what exactly was wearing my patience so thin. Tom stayed silent, his expression dull, as though his spine had been wrung out and left limp. "Look, it's normal for married couples to want their own space," I said, keeping my tone calm, knowing how important it was to maintain control despite everything. But her sharp reply wasn't far behind. "He never needed space before you came along." Her voice buzzed with indignation, each word gnawing at my resolve as if I were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to fall. And then, as these conversations often go, Tom finally spoke. But alas, he didn't side with me. "No, Mom, it's fine, Beatrice isn't. She's not unreasonable," he stammered, his voice as weak and soggy as cardboard left in the rain. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I just can't believe it. First Sarah tells me Beatrice is making a fuss over our visits, and now you—" His words trailed off, fading into the silence of the room. Raising his eyebrows, Tom turned to me as though I truly were the source of all the problems. "Yes, she did, and I think she's right," Sarah chimed in, indulging her own narrative as though convinced I had no right to interfere in their family matters. "Family is family," and her words landed like the final brushstroke on a painting, completing my inner collapse. Hearing it from Tom hurt the most. It felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs, like a deflated balloon 2 days after the party. The call ended with promises of yet another family meeting, one that felt more like a summit to negotiate the terms of my surrender. Everything was done by the book, pretending nothing had happened. Tom returned to his couch, resuming his championship in channel surfing as though this were all normal. Mrs. Falcone carried on with her errands, while Sarah, with her subtle manipulations, played puppeteer with Tom whenever it suited her. But the harshest blow came when Tom's sister, Sarah, began spreading rumors about me throughout town. For a moment, my blood boiled, and I felt the anger rise, but I didn't let it take control. I knew I needed to handle this properly. I had to talk to her. That moment came much sooner than I had anticipated. I found her on a Saturday morning at the market. She was filling her basket with groceries, and as I approached, I saw her eyes, empty at first, lift and meet mine. She didn't notice me immediately, but I stepped closer and spoke. "Sarah," I said, calm but brimming with internal tension. She looked up, and her gaze, full of disdain, registered my presence. She immediately rolled her eyes. "What do you want?" she asked in her usual mocking tone. But I was prepared. "We need to talk." "This is about the stories you've been spreading," I said firmly, not giving her a chance to escape the conversation. She snorted loudly and smirked. "Stories? I have no idea what you're talking about." Her grin spread across her face, and the apple in her hand bounced aimlessly up and down. "Sarah, the rumors about me being controlling, about me being this and that," I wasn't letting her dodge the topic. She laughed. "And what are you going to do if I don't stop? You think you can boss me around?" Her laughter was loud and arrogant. I kept my composure. "Listen, spreading lies isn't just some petty thing. It's slander, and I won't tolerate it." I looked her in the eye, and for a moment, silence settled between us. "Are you going to sue me, Beatrice?" she mocked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You don't have the guts." I responded firmly. "Yes, I will sue you if I have to. Reputations are at stake here." Arrogance practically oozed from her as Sarah leaned in closer, her face almost brushing mine. "You're completely out of your depth," she said, her words as sharp as a knife blade, cold and cutting. Then she added with an undisguised smirk, "A lawyer threatening to sue me? That's rich, Beatrice. I'll give you a chance to drop this nonsense before it gets serious." Her challenge was blatant, and her eyes glinted with merciless confidence. She stepped away as if expecting I wouldn't dare to respond. I stood still, though inside I was boiling. Sarah, the one behind all of this, was now laughing in my face and dismissing my threats. Her predatory expression and her voice, taut like a wire stretched to its limit, lingered as she turned on her heel, nearly knocking over a display of canned beans. Her laughter echoed down the aisle, leaving me standing there, as if I had just lost a battle I hadn't even realized I was fighting. I walked home slower than usual, mulling over everything that had happened. It all seemed so tangled, so unfair, leaving my mind in chaos. But I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face the consequences. Later that evening, when Tom returned, I decided to tell him what had happened. He stood in the hallway, taking off his shoes, one of which seemed to have picked up something frozen solid. As he removed the second shoe, I began speaking slowly. "Did you do what I told Sarah?" His eyes were tired but cautious. My voice was steady, and despite the storm brewing inside me, I spoke calmly, refusing to let my emotions get the better of me. "I threatened her with a lawsuit if she doesn't stop spreading rumors," I said, ensuring every word was deliberate. Tom's face flushed red, then paled, as though he couldn't believe what I'd dared to do. He was stunned, his lips trembling. "You couldn't just leave it alone? Why do you have to pour fuel on the fire, Beatrice?" he said, and I felt his anger, tinged with worry, color his words with painful hues. But I couldn't stay silent. "Because it's wrong, Tom. And I won't let anyone walk all over me." My words burst forth like a storm breaking through barriers. Silence filled the room. We stood there, wordless, for what felt like forever. I could feel every second pulling us further apart. All I wanted was for him to support me. But instead, we were drowning in the weight of unspoken conflict, unable to find a way out. We were standing on opposite shores, and despite the lost look in his eyes, I knew I had found the strength to stand my ground. This was more than a family squabble. This was a line I had drawn in the sand, and I couldn't erase it. He stood there, lost and helpless, his expression now an indelible mark on his face. I sank onto the couch, seething with anger. The gossip might quiet down a little, but Sarah was the kind of weed that never let the seedling rest. I knew she would start her games again, and no one but me could stop her. It was in her nature, to crawl, to invade every space she could, setting traps wherever possible. And Tom, I feared, would never find the courage to stand up to her manipulations. But for now, I needed to cool off and plan my next move in this ugly game. Sarah had pushed me into weighing every option, like a mental pros and cons list I had to keep running in my head. I had signed up for a life with Tom, not a daily soap opera with his family. But when things spiraled even further out of control, when the situation began to spin wildly, I felt something akin to a mistake spinning in my mind, like loose change tumbling in a dryer before finally clattering to the floor. And then, as if on cue, Mrs. Falcone, the town's self-proclaimed queen of gossip and Sarah's godmother, called me. Her voice chirped like a bird that had just discovered a worm. "Beatrice, darling," she said, her tone falsely sweet but so transparently provocative that I instantly recognized her game. "We're throwing a little engagement party for Sarah. It's happening at Luigi's next week. We'd love to have you there." It was as if she were issuing me a challenge herself. I stared at the silent phone after hanging up, the feeling of a setup lingering in the air like rancid smoke. Tom was already on edge, and now I had to tell him about the next step. I walked over to the kitchen table and said, "Guess who made plans for us next week?" Tom sat at the table, his brow furrowed as if trying to piece everything together in his mind. "Who?" he asked, looking at me with suspicion. I didn't hesitate and said it outright, "Your sister's engagement party. We've been invited, courtesy of Mrs. Falcone." His face immediately grew a shade paler, the creases on his forehead deepening. "Oh, hell," he muttered, and I realized he understood that this wasn't just an invitation, it was a trap. "So, what's the plan, Tom? Do we roll over and play nice, or what?" I asked, watching his frozen expression. He stayed silent for too long. I wasn't going to tolerate it any longer. "Come on, spit it out," I said. Tom stood in front of me, his face more tense than I'd ever seen it. His words didn't need any explanation, and I felt anger boiling in my chest. He had always sided with his family. And me? I seemed to always remain on the sidelines, never finding my place in this theatrical production they called family life. His words, cold and firm, lashed out like a whip. "Family comes first," he said, "but where did that leave me, Beatrice? Where did that leave us?" I felt my whole being protesting, my body rejecting his decrees. He was my husband, and that should have meant more. "You don't get it," I began, my voice cold and laced with restrained fury. "This isn't just dinner. It's not just another gesture for them, Tom. It's a game, and I don't want to be their pawn anymore." He stepped closer, his hands sliding over mine, gripping them tightly enough that I barely felt my fingers clench in response. "We're a team," the words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer a team, just two players on opposite sides of a barricade. And there I was, caught in the middle of this game, surrendering to the whims of his family, voiceless. "You can't just stay silent," I continued, interrupting his attempts to respond. "You're always talking about family, but in our home, there hasn't been an us for a long time. It's just your family, your obligations, your submissive game. Where do I fit into that?" Tom went quiet, and the silence between us became almost tangible. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't anticipated this turn. I felt as though I was losing him, like he was slipping into his own thoughts, searching for something within himself to lead to a resolution. I saw his gaze falter, his attempt to hold back the impulse to hurl another accusation at me. But his face settled into that familiar look I'd seen countless times over the years, the one he wore when he didn't want to but felt forced to defend himself. I smiled, but it wasn't from happiness. It was born of desperation. Realizing that no resolution was coming, I felt my patience wearing thin. All of this, empty words. He either didn't understand or simply refused to understand what I was going through. And as I stood there before him, I caught myself thinking that it might be easier to be alone than to continue this endless fight for recognition that would never come. In that moment, I felt as though I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and every step back was a step into the unknown. But I also realized that every step forward into the abyss would be a final decision. And maybe this was the moment when I needed to choose, between myself and everything around me. The silence between us grew so thick it was almost palpable. It wasn't just a pause, it was a wall that had long been built between us. I felt his hands tightening around mine, but I couldn't pull them away, couldn't step back. "You're always telling me what to do," I finally said, breaking the silence again. "But you never ask me how I feel. What I want." Tom took a deep breath, his gaze growing more focused, but that clarity didn't change anything. He was still the same man, the same person who chose not to be with me when it mattered. And at that moment, I realized that perhaps we truly had no future together. Later, I sat in a bar, staring at my phone screen, trying to ignore the trembling in my hands. My fingers moved instinctively over the letters on the screen, as if it were my last act of defiance. When I sent the message to Tom, I didn't feel relief, only a cold emptiness that grew more tangible with each passing moment. Rereading the text, I realized that not long ago, this would have been impossible for me, not just to send such words but to feel liberated by them. Yet I seemed to have reached a point where I could no longer suppress the silent protest within me. The bar was dark and grim, filled with the smell of old wood and beer. There was nothing special about it. Just a simple, unremarkable corner for those who didn't want to face what was happening in their lives. I never thought I'd find myself here at such a moment. Honestly, I never thought I'd find myself in this situation at all. I had always hoped I could maintain the facade of a woman who could still be part of their world, part of this family performance. But now I understood that the role I'd been assigned had long since lost all meaning. My gaze drifted across the ceiling, where dim lamps cast a pale light on the counter and wooden stools. I tried to piece together what had happened, to force my thoughts into a coherent picture. But I couldn't. Everything was blurred, like sliding snow that catches you off guard before you can escape from under it. Behind the bar stood a man with a grim face, his hand mechanically pouring me another shot of whiskey without asking if I needed it. He, like me, was silent. Silence was enough for us to understand each other. Time felt irrelevant, and I didn't notice it slipping away. My eyes refused to focus. The call from Tom was just another reminder that they still believed there was something meaningful between us, that we were still and thus. But it wasn't true anymore. It was a hollow formality, nothing more. Answering his call, seeing his name on the screen, it all brought back the same feeling of futility. I placed the phone face down and picked up the glass again. The mix of anger and despair felt so familiar that I could no longer distinguish which one was dominant. But one thing was clear: I was exhausted. Not just tired, but deeply disillusioned with the years I had spent trying to understand it all. And here I was, in a bar, lost in thoughts about what had just happened. Tom's words, the family accusations, the endless demands, they all blurred together into an incoherent mess. My love for him had become an illusion, barely a mirage I tried to discern through dust and pain. I thought I could endure it, but I was wrong. Maybe there was no way back. If I had learned anything over the years, it was this: you must always be ready to let go. Let go of people who don't value you, let go of ideals that no longer exist. When I stood up, the phone lit up again, but I didn't even glance at the screen. I headed for the door. The cold evening air hit my face, and I slowed my pace after a few steps, looking back at the world I was leaving behind. It felt strange to sense freedom when my entire life seemed to have collapsed behind me. But that cold, fresh air told me one thing: I didn't have to go back to what had already fallen apart. I was tired, so tired of it all: the pointless arguments, the endless demands, the fake smiles, and the hostile faces that were supposed to support me. Of feeling like I was drowning in a sea of others' expectations, their fears, and incessant complaints. In the center of it all, I couldn't breathe anymore, couldn't keep playing this role. In a partnership where I should have had someone at my back, I was alone. And you know what? That was better than clinging to something that no longer existed. My solitude felt almost like liberation. By the time the room stopped spinning that night, by the time my mind cleared a little after yet another chaotic scene at the restaurant, I realized it was time to move on. No more games. No more hateful manipulations, no more performances for a family that had only ever seen me as a pawn to fuel their dramas. I walked out of the bar, leaving behind the noise, the shouting, and the stench of beer. The night air was cold, tinged with rain and earth. The city lights blurred into foggy smears, like watercolor stains on a canvas. The road ahead was uncertain, as was everything waiting for me. But for the first time in a long while, I felt that this road was mine. I could walk it however I chose, even if it meant walking it alone. I'll take responsibility for that last night, the one where everything at the restaurant exploded. The engagement was ruined. The groom, finally fed up with all the drama, called it off then and there. No one could have predicted it would unfold like that. My former mother-in-law lost her mind, behaving worse than any reality show where chairs fly through the air. It was unbelievable. And so, it all fell apart. I filed for divorce. I severed all phone ties with Tom, ignored his calls, and deleted his messages. All that remained was to free myself from their fears and games. They were still in that house, in that hell, driving each other mad. But I was gone. At some point, I realized I had finally stopped holding my breath, as if I had been underwater for years and had finally surfaced. Life started to feel simpler. But all of that came after that night ended. Now, weeks later, things are quieter. I sat in a cafe, sipping my usual strong coffee, with no one paying attention to my thoughts. The barista gave me a silent nod, as usual. I didn't feel the tension or anticipation I once had. There was no family here, no judgmental looks, none of that suffocating weight. I could just sit and drink my coffee without guilt or obligation. I was free to spend my time as I pleased, unbound by anyone's expectations. I reveled in this freedom, which had felt so foreign to me for so long. No more strange calls, no messages filled with apologies. Just peace, the quiet rhythm of ordinary days, free from conflict and endless compromises. I sat on a couch I'd brought with me despite all my moves. It was old but still my favorite. The springs were worn out, but it supported my back just right, as it always had. I turned on the TV, some crime show where the bad guys were always caught by the midpoint. I didn't feel dread or loneliness. Just calm. I breathed steadily, without hurry, without fear. And sitting there, I realized I had finally left that world behind. It had been heavy and destructive, but I had survived it. When I got up to have dinner, my phone suddenly buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It might have been Tom, trying to reach me from someone else's phone. I didn't open it. I had neither the energy nor the desire to re-enter that world. I deleted the message. Not today. Not ever. People had told me I'd regret my decision, that loneliness would only bring me pain. But here I was, and there wasn't a drop of regret in my heart. That day stretched out calmly and confidently, ending with a glass of something strong and a book I'd been meaning to read for ages. It all felt familiar. This was my life, tough but fair, free from anyone else's opinions. And I was savoring every bit of what it had become.